if you take those ideas seriously, they will end you. You know, you will disappear. Your world will end, and some other world will start to take shape, and you won't know what that other world looks like. And I think that's why people don't like to read these sorts of things. Is um, they're challenging is an understatement.
And welcome to another installment of Behind Greatness by Inspire. It's Luciano here speaking as your host. Before we get into it, I just want to thank the listener for coming on board again for this episode. Please, when you have a chance, rate us on whatever platform you use. We're on virtually every platform, and also share with your family and friends. I can't ask that enough. It is the way that we are spreading our message, and it's our preferred way, and it's working. So we're, as our regular listener knows, we have been having guests from all around the world, and it's exciting for us because this platform allows us to gain perspectives and gain opinions and gain expertise that we wouldn't otherwise have, obviously. And today is going to be no different. And before we get started, again, another reminder: we are a registered charity. So for anybody out there who wishes to donate, you can simply go to behindgreatness.org and see where you can donate. Being a charity, we issue tax receipts as well, and it helps the mission. We're a volunteer organization, and we love doing what we're doing. And this is why we're here now sitting with Jeff Kripal. So right into it. Jeff Kripal is the Associate Dean of the Faculty and Graduate Programs in the School of the Humanities and the J. Newton Rayzor Chair in Philosophy and Religious Thought at Rice University in Houston. He is also the Associate Director of the Center for Theory and Research at the Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California. I also want to talk about Big Sur, by the way. There's a connection here I have with that. Jeff is the author of 10 books, including most recently The Superhumanities, Historical Precedents, Moral Objections, New Realities, as well as The Secret Body, Erotic and Esoteric Currents in the History of Religions. In Superhumanities, he intuits an emerging new order of knowledge that can engage in robust moral criticism, but also affirm the superhuman or non-human dimensions of our histories, cultures, and futures. He is presently working on a 3-volume study of paranormal currents in the sciences, modern esoteric literature, and the hidden history of science fiction for the University of Chicago Press, collectively entitled The Superstory: Science Fiction and Some Emergent Mythologies. His full body of work can be seen at jeffkripal.com, and we can put that in the show notes. Last note, he thinks he may be Spider-Man. So Jeff, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I want to thank actually one of our previous guests, Russell Targ, for putting us on to you back in the fall 2021. He got me really curious about who you were. So we did a little bit of research and said, this guy sounds really interesting. And so we reached out. So thank you for being open.
Yeah, no, of course.
Why do you think you're Spider-Man?
I just do. I just think I am. I mean, I grew up with Spider-Man. He was my childhood hero. And like a lot of kids, I think I might be him.
That is very interesting that's at the end of your bio. So the listener might not care, and you might not either, but I'm going to share it just because it works. I am the oldest of 4 siblings. We're all 5.5 years apart, or excuse me, we're all born within 5.5 years. And each one of my siblings received a middle name from my parents, except for me.
Okay.
So when my youngest brother was born, they gave him 2 middle names. So I was really upset because I didn't have one, and now my baby brother has 2. And so I told my mother, I remember where I was, and my mother was at the kitchen. She was at the sink. She was washing some vegetables. And I said to her, Mom, I want a middle name. She goes, well, you don't have one. We can't give you one now. It's too late. She goes, I want it to be Spider-Man. So I imagine that's what I could be.
Yeah. I to be a little more serious about it, I grew up with him. I was born in 62. I think that was the year of the first appearance of Spider-Man, actually.
Yeah, the early 60s. I remember this. Yeah.
Yeah. And what was so remarkable about those Marvel heroes in the 60s now and the 70s was that they were self-mocking. They had a kind of reflexivity that Superman and Batman did not have and wouldn't know what to do with. I mean, Batman and Superman were kind of blocky and, righteous and it just
perfect.
sort of perfect. And Spider-Man was a freaking mess. Yeah. And he was always making fun of his enemies and himself, and he was tortured. And I just, I admired that. I admired that as I still admire that as an adult. I think that's a healthy attitude.
So I've never thought of that before. He was or is a character that's more playful. He's more childlike than all the others.
Yeah.
He's not snarky or dark or pretentious.
No.
And he could climb walls.
And he can climb, and he has, stuff coming out of his hands. And I mean, he's you can do all kinds of things with Spider-Man. I have. So I like the myth. I like the character.
Well, you've spun a web of sorts of material over your lifespan. And when I say material, I don't mean just the books that you keep writing, but the experiences, the human and superhuman experiences that you've had.
Yeah.
So I circled it as I read it in your bio, that your latest book wants to engage and affirm the superhuman dimensions of our histories. What does that mean?
Well, it means something very specific. I mean, if you work in the humanities in a university or college, you're used to reducing every human experience down to some kind of social context or some kind of historical construction. You're always going to flatten out the human being into essentially a social political animal. That's what you're going to do. But it turns out that if you look at the history of the humanities carefully and you actually read these people, they've often have these transcendent experiences of cosmic mind, or they have a precognitive dream, or they have some extraordinary experience that actually inspires what it is they write about. So there are these, what I call these vertical dimensions. We were good at the horizontal dimension in the humanities, but we're really bad at the vertical dimension. And essentially my argument is, look, people are going to continue to ignore us and defund us if all we talk about is the horizontal. We also have to talk about the vertical, and we have to put those two things together to make this picture pop in a positive way as well as a critical way. The criticism is crucial, but it's not sufficient.
This is why I've been excited to talk to you, because you're obviously unafraid to talk about. So as an academic and intellectual, you're not afraid to talk, and a public one at that, and one working at a university in a leadership position at that. You seem to be unafraid to talk about the superhuman, the paranormal. And in fact, I've heard you talk about the paranormal and define it in a much more sobering way, perhaps a more real way than it's perceived to be defined now. Actually, why don't we start there? Because I think it'd be a great starting point. Paranormal, what does that mean?
Right. So the word was coined in 1903 by a French psychologist and lawyer by the name of Joseph Maxwell in a French book called Les Phénomènes Psychiques, the psychical phenomena. And Maxwell was trying to get away from the traditional category of the supernatural. The supernatural was invented, by the way, in the 13th century, and it referred to some act of God outside the natural order that was impinging into the natural order. So for something to be supernatural, it had to be from God. When Maxwell coined the word paranormal, and he was speaking and writing in French, by the way, not English, he meant the opposite. He meant what I call the supernatural, 3 words. He meant something entirely natural and within the world, but something we clearly don't understand and that clearly happens. And so he was trying to push his scientific colleagues towards a kind of broader model of what's possible and what the natural world really is and what a human being really is. And he was studying things like mediums and poltergeist phenomena and knockings and floating tables and, things that I think most people think are always fraudulent and that they kind of roll their eyes at, but that it turns out are not always fraudulent and actually happen. They're paranormal, they're normal, which doesn't mean they're supernatural. It just means that they're following nature in a way that we don't understand. So that's what the word means, in its origins in 1903. The way I use it is I use it very technically to describe what a philosopher would call dual aspect monism, which we can get into later if you want. And essentially, it just means there's something happening in the subjective or mental world. There's something happening in the material or physical world, and they're corresponding in a very eerie or uncanny way. One is not causing the other, but they're emerging from this shared ground that's invisible to the human being.
Well, can I say that you use the word eerie because we don't understand it. So we label it as something haunting or eerie.
Right. When someone says, oh, that's eerie or that's uncanny, what they generally mean is it feels different to me. It does not follow the world the way it's supposed to work. But there's some kind of correspondence. So there's some kind of connection between what's happening in my mind and what's happening in the physical world. And that's not supposed to happen, but it clearly is.
Yeah. You said that in your work, you like to occupy a third space. So I guess this would be the space that we're talking about.
Yeah, this is the third space. And by that, I just mean, I'm not interested in belief. I think beliefs are often wrong and they're often dangerous. They're always interpretations. I'm also not interested in debunking. I think debunking is wrong. I think it's often mistaken and it's fake. It gives fake explanations for things it doesn't understand, and then it pretends those are adequate, and they're not. So I think we're much more honest when we inhabit this third space that's neither debunking nor believing. And we just sit with these experiences and we say, okay, these things happened. Let's try to figure out what's going on here by putting a whole bunch of them together on our table and thinking about them at the same time.
Yeah, you did say, and I bolded this as well because I wanted to maybe explore this a little bit with you, if we haven't already, because you said, I believe in belief. I don't believe in beliefs.
Yeah. What I mean by that is I understand that belief is incredibly powerful and that it allows certain things to happen. And that when people pray to God, for example, or pray to the Virgin Mary or pray to Ganesha or whatever they pray to, that it works. It often works. But I don't personally believe in the Virgin Mary or the Hindu god Ganesh. Or God, the way most people think of God. I just think belief it's a mechanism that allows them to tap into these paranormal forces and then to attribute those forces to some external deity, which, supports their social system, but doesn't work for me personally. Because I know all about these different social systems. I know that spontaneous healing happens all over the world. For as far back as we can see, it doesn't matter what God you believe in or what saint you're praying to. These things can and will happen. So that's why I say that I believe in belief. It works. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it doesn't, by the way. But I don't believe in beliefs. I don't sign my name to these individual mythologies that exist in France or Northern India or China or Tibet or wherever you want to go.
I told you that I started reading your book and I realized that this is an exercise that I really need to spend time to absorb, which is which is a challenge because, and we talked about this before we recorded, most of us are distracted by our daily routines. And ironically, our daily routines involve communication through devices rather than the absorption of knowledge through people. And so I find myself distracted a lot and not allocating enough time to absorb messages that I'd like to message. And so this is part of the reason why we're doing a podcast, because it's an easier format.
Yeah, and if you take those ideas seriously, they will end you. You know, you will disappear. Your world will end, and some other world will start to take shape, and you won't know what that other world looks like. And I think that's why people don't like to read these sorts of things, is they're too they're challenging is an understatement.
It's very esoteric, but I mean, I don't even like the word esoteric, because we say it coming from a world that's very constricted and repressed.
Yeah, I actually like the word esoteric, and here's why. I think a lot of these truths literally are esoteric, and by that I don't mean that I have a secret that now I can tell you and then you know it. That's not what I mean at all. I mean that there are certain forms of knowledge that most people simply can't know. It's not that you haven't told them. It's that even if you told them, they wouldn't hear you. It wouldn't process. And so I think esoteric is actually a very accurate word. And I think the reason a lot of communities have been esoteric in history, frankly, is to protect themselves, from persecution and from people who will not understand what they're saying. And even if they did, they would reject it. And so they're protecting themselves from persecution historically. That may not be quite as necessary today in a civil, free society, but sometimes it is.
And persecution happens in different ways.
Yeah, and persecution happens today. Let's not be naive about that. People are harassed for their thinking and for their thoughts and their beliefs today. Both certainly in my culture, my country. I won't speak of the Canadian scene. Certainly in the U.S., people are trying all the time to shut people down for what they think and what they want to say.
It happens here often.
Yeah,
not as cuckoo and as in some parts of the U.S.
Yeah,
but yeah.
Yeah. It's pretty cuckoo.
So let's go back to your leadership position at the university, because I had also asked you, do you run into difficulties because you are who you are, you do what you do, and you explore ideas that most in your world don't. And so I asked you if that's frowned upon, if you get a backlash at all.
Yeah, I get asked that question all the time. Yeah. The question boils down to what do you deal with the pushback? And my answer is always, what pushback? And what I mean by that is, listen, I get pushback. I don't want to deny that. But humanists and intellectuals, first of all, I love them. And I mean that. I mean that very genuinely. I love intellectuals. I love humanists. I think what they do is the most important thing in the world. And I mean that. I'm not exaggerating. I think if the world really absorbed what humanists are trying to say, we would live in a much better world, period. So I am perfectly happy supporting and nurturing what humanists do already. And when I talk about this vertical dimension that humanists don't do, a lot of these intellectuals, they're in the closet. They know I'm right. They know I'm right. They're just like, I'm not going to say that. You go say that, Jeff. You do that. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to go say that. So my feeling about the humanities is that it's a contentious family. We fight a lot amongst ourselves, but there's a lot of people in the closet on this one. And I think, and a lot of, also among scientists, by the way, I think most intellectuals and scientists, and those are not the same people always, by the way, are very supportive of these kinds of questions. If you do it I don't want to say right,
Yeah.
but if
But
you
you had
do
it
it
in your head. You've been trained to think right.
yeah, if you
Hmm.
do it in a rigorous, disciplined way, they're like, oh, that's how we can talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what they don't want, what they're afraid of, and I understand this, I share this, is they don't want to sound like the tabloids.
They
They
want the
don't,
permission to talk about it, but you need to provide the rationale for that permission.
yeah. One of the biggest compliments I ever got, it was actually secondhand. I wasn't said, this wasn't said to me directly. I heard it secondhand, but I gave a lecture once at a university, and one of the colleagues apparently said something like, that guy can make UFOs sound Ivy League. And I was like, that's the project. That's it. That's essentially what the project is to make this stuff smart. Let me put it that way. And to see paranormal phenomena not as schlock or as fraud, but as culture trying to speak to us, trying to create itself.
And I think that's the irony, is because the paranormal, or what you're discussing here, what we're discussing here as the paranormal and beliefs in non-matter, it does come from culture. You don't need to intellectualize it. But that's the irony, is that you need to provide an intellectual basis in order to, I guess, have that culture rise back up from the ashes. Because you and I both come from old European civilizations, centuries and centuries back, and these folks, centuries and centuries back, were close to the land and close to nature. They thought about these things. They lived these things. It wasn't abnormal to discuss these things and to grow up in believing these things.
On the other hand, our ancestors were often persecuted and silenced for taking some of this stuff seriously. Listen, I was trained in a Roman Catholic seminary, and I was trained in what we called spiritual direction. And rule number one is spiritual direction is you affirm some kinds of experiences and you don't confirm other kinds.
Yes.
You nudge people down a particular orthodox pathway, and all of the heterodox or the heretical stuff you try to cut off. So what I think is happening today is we don't have that orthodoxy to discipline us all. And so people are having these experiences like they always did. And now they're talking about them and nobody's stopping them. And we're going to get a new culture out of this. I think you're right. I think this is okay. This is culture trying to change itself. And to go back to Spider-Man for a minute, the paranormal is a lot like Spider-Man. It's constantly making fun of itself. It's constantly mocking the social order. And I just love that. I'm just like, yeah, you need to be mocked. You need to be made fun of. You need to laugh. Your beliefs are ridiculous. And I think that's what this material does. If we let it, if we just believe it, it's just more absurdity. It's just like, come on, that's not what's going on.
This is not a digression, because I want to go back to the UFO thing too. But laughing at itself, and that is something we like to explore here as well. We don't do it often enough. And there was an interview you gave a few years ago where there was you and John Price. So it's got a wonderful podcast. Yeah. Wonderful podcast. The Sacred Speaks is called. Yeah. Wonderful podcast. And you guys briefly touched upon comedians.
On what?
Comedians.
Oh yeah, comedians. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And we've been wanting for a while to have a comedian on the podcast, because I think comedians teach such a great lesson. But anyway, the lesson that you were giving what you were discussing is how comedians are really effective because they allow us to laugh at ourselves, because they mock the system, but they could only mock the system if they actually live in it. Otherwise, there's no anchor of understanding.
Right.
And these are people who'd be persecuted, maimed, or killed not so long ago for expressing
Yeah.
our opinions.
Yeah. Yeah. Comedians walk a very thin line. They walk a tightrope. And I really admire a really good comedian because, and at least in the States, we have different comedic traditions, and they kind of flow into one another. But two of the strongest are the Jewish comedic tradition and the Black comedic tradition. And
100%.
I mean, come on. I mean, that's what comedy is. It's a critique of the social norm. And I really think that's so. And so I think I try to weave humor, frankly, into my scholarship because I think it's really important. There's a philosophical punch to it that it's not just tangential or distracting. It actually means something. It allows people to step out of their worldview and to look back on it.
So there are people who have been stepping out of their worldview that you've been involved with. We had a couple of them on the podcast as well. You were a judge. One of several judges, a half dozen judges at the Bigelow Institute. And one of your co-judges, Leslie Kane, was recently on the podcast as well. And so she's a ufologist in the strictest sense, right? She really helped blow the doors open for the global conversation several years ago. And then Sharon Rowlett, who is one of the runner-ups.
Oh, sure, Sharon, yeah.
Tell us a little bit about the Bigelow Institute, why you got involved. What's up with that?
Well, it's the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies. Robert Bigelow was a aerospace entrepreneur. He helped build the space station, actually, and contracted with NASA and worked on human habitat, really, in outer space. That's really what he made his money in motels, but he really got into aerospace big time and was very much a part of the aerospace industry. He's always had, for the last 30 years at least, he's had a profound interest in what we might call the paranormal or the subject of life after death, which are really the same thing at the end of the day, by the way. He bought a ranch in Utah called Skinwalker Ranch in the 90s and sent a scientific team in and also contracted with the government for a secret UFO study from 2008 to 2010. So he's been heavily involved in this research on a kind of government and level that's been quite profound. And 2 years ago now, he decided to start something called the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies, which is his way of trying to advance research into what is essentially afterlife communication. And so last year he sponsored a contest and he asked 6 of us to judge this contest, and we got 205 essays. And he gave away over $1.5 million, and we judged the essays. He gave us complete freedom to do that, and the 6 of us got together and we worked for 6 months and we read through these essays and came up with a list of 1, 2, 3, and then there were 2 other categories that we came up with. So it's in some ways it's very traditional in the States here that this kind of study gets funded by individuals. Unfortunately, there are no long-standing programs in the universities or colleges. It tends to get funded by a single donor like Mr. Bigelow.
Right.
So this is a pretty standard move. And I think I'm not going to speak for Robert, but I think he very much wants to work with the academy, but also outside it, because he wants more freedom and wants more free thought than I think is probably possible in the academy today. The idea that the human being is not the body is pure heresy in a academic context. I mean, it's just assumed that you are your body and you are your historical and social location. And of course, if there's some kind of life after death, that's clearly not true, or it's clearly not adequately or completely true. I mean, obviously, the body's a kind of temporary portal into the social or political world. But at least in most of the religions I've studied, it's not the final truth.
You did say that the human being can be porous.
Yeah.
And we were talking about dreams and dreaming.
Yeah.
You touched upon this at the beginning of the conversation with some biblical references, loosely. As that dreams, you also said dreams and religions are actually quite close.
Yeah.
Let's expand on that a little bit, because my question not comes from understanding how religions and dreams are connected, but every time I read the word religion or I say the word religion, it gets muddled with the word in my head, the word dogma. And I want to free myself from that, because I don't believe that's where you were going with this particular point. But regardless, it feels like religion has had a bad name because of this. And I'm not a religious person to begin with, but I just want to get to an understanding. So let's then ask the question again. Why do you say and think that human beings are porous? And why did that comment that you gave me in an earlier conversation come from a discussion on dreaming?
Well, because human beings are porous. We tend to. So I think the way we generally think of ourselves is as a container. That there's a body, there's a physical body, and there's some kind of ghost in this biological machine, right? That's me or that's you. Mm-hmm. And so we kind of work with this very folk kind of notion of a physical body that holds a person. And we historically, human beings have been very anxious about how that container is open to the world, particularly through food and sex. Those are the two really, really big things, but also disease and also death, because these are all moments in a human life cycle in which that bodily container is not so containing. Things come out of it and things come into it. And when people dream, dream's a pretty big category. A lot of things can happen. Once the social ego or the sense of self comes down, all kinds of things can come in, including dreams, but also what people have called spirits or possession or all kinds of entities. And so that's what I mean when I say the human being is porous. It's not this closed container that people want it to be. And we're not close to one another. I mean, I'm talking to you now. I'm getting into your head, as it were, as we say. Mm-hmm. You're getting into my head somehow. So, we're open to one another as well. And I think a lot of our social and political problems is we're trying to keep this container contained. And it's not going to happen. It's not going to stay contained.
That's why ideologies have an issue with a long lifespan.
Yeah, and ideologies also protect their borders, because that's again about the container. Yeah. That's this imaginary line, like my body that cuts off the nation state from some other quote unquote alien foreign nation state. And of course, it's an illusion. It's a complete freaking illusion. But that's what we pretend. And so, immigrants are a problem, food's a problem, sex is a problem, disease is a problem, spirits are a problem. Anything that violates or reveals the porosity of the human being or the human community then becomes a challenge or a problem. And that's what I meant by my comment.
You brought up Jill Bolte Taylor, her TED Talk, in another discussion. I think you had a discussion with John Price too. Oh yeah, with John Price. We had Jill Bolte Taylor also on the podcast.
Oh, okay.
High energy human being, and a force. So anyway, and not to stump for her, but her episodes on this podcast, I'd recommend to listen to it. But you brought her up, and the reason why I'm bringing her up now is because she had this experience that was out of body.
Yeah.
And her brain split in two, so to speak.
Yeah. She split
Metaphor.
into. She split into.
Yeah, she split into. Right. She split into. And she was in this right brain field, she calls it, where she felt completely different than what she had ever felt before.
Right.
And fast forward, 15 years, this is where she is living her life. She's living her life in the right side of her brain, and she welcomes others to do that. In short, I asked her about dreaming, and I was surprised. So maybe I'll have her back on the podcast to ask her this, but I was surprised to get her response on dreaming. Dreaming for her was not enjoyable. It was too chaotic. It was not something she can make sense of. So she had, I'm not sure about has, but had no use for it. And the conversation didn't go much anywhere else. But I found it surprising because, to your point, dreaming is evidence of our porosity.
Yeah, I wouldn't deny what Jill said there. I mean, I think, again, I said dreaming is a very broad category.
Yes.
And I think for most of us, it's just a lot of bullshit every night. It is chaotic, it's confusing, and you wake up and you're like, who the hell was telling that story? I mean, that was weird. And so there's a part of us telling another part of us a story every night that we just don't understand. And so I understand her feeling about that. But sometimes people have what we sometimes can call big dreams, or people will have a precognitive dream of something that's going to happen the next day or the next week or 3 years down the life cycle, and they'll act on that dream. They'll follow it, or they'll take it seriously. So I don't want to equate all dreaming, but I do think dreaming is one way that people are porous. I think having a stroke, by the way, in the brain that Jill had, and shutting down your left hemisphere is a great way to become really, really porous.
Right. It's probably one of the best human ways to biologically.
Yeah, unfortunately, it will also often kill you.
Yes.
Or you won't come back from it in a very good shape. So I don't recommend a stroke, but in Jill's case, it knocked her out of her left hemisphere. But here's the thing: if you read Taylor carefully, it's not clear in her book whether she thinks that this is really just the right hemisphere talking, or there's another form of consciousness that's being beamed through the right hemisphere.
She avoids that discussion.
What's that?
She avoids the discussion.
Okay, well, that's because she's probably a good neuroanatomist, because you can't have that discussion as a neuroanatomist.
Yes.
But you can have that discussion as a historian of religions, or as a philosopher, because that is the question. Is the brain producing these experiences, or is it mediating these experiences? Mm-hmm. And I personally think the latter is going on. And the reason I say that is not because I know that, but because once I assume that position, I can then let lots of other things on my table. And I can say, okay, these things are all possible now, because the brain is no longer producing consciousness, it's mediating consciousness. It's like, as I often say, it's like your cell phone. Your cell phone does not produce the internet. It mediates the internet or the Wi-Fi, and it turns it in this personal screen for you. And you can throw that cell phone against the wall. You can destroy it, and you will destroy its ability to mediate that Wi-Fi, but you will not harm the Wi-Fi. No. You will not hurt it. And so once you say that, once you start thinking in those terms, you're like, maybe that's what death is. Death is a destruction of the cell phone. It can no longer mediate and personalize the Wi-Fi, but consciousness still is perfectly fine. Nothing happened. In fact, consciousness might be freed by the death of the body.
You've said that the conception of, you're not the first to say it, obviously, but you've asserted it. You've said that our conception of the afterlife is, the problem with it is that it's very ego-based.
Yeah, we just, again, we think of the afterlife in terms of this body and this brain and this social ego, and of course it kind of sounds silly because it is silly. But if you think about the afterlife in terms of the survival of consciousness that somehow transcends or is not the body and it's not the person, the social ego, then suddenly it makes a lot of sense. And you can take people's experiences much more rigorously and much more seriously. But again, you don't have to believe the specifics. You can take the experience and understand that the specifics are what's being mediated. That's what's coming through, because they're of course alive when they're telling you these stories. And as soon as they start to talk, culture's going to come in, history's going to come in, family's going to come in, everything's going to come flying back, and they're going to tell you about their experience through the mediation of their own social and historical position.
The container, the boundaries.
Right. The container is going to tell you what it was like to be outside the container.
We had I've mentioned this recently several times, but we've had a few people on this podcast who have had near-death experiences, and two of note. One was a surgeon.
Was that Eben?
No, not even Alexander. It was a orthopedic surgeon. Tony Chicoria. And the other was an artist. And they both came at the experiences very differently, and they both had very different experiences. And they're both blown away by it. But it was interesting that the artist, she was not working from the belief of a container. She was already there, open to the experience that was happening to her.
Yeah.
Ironically, the container, when she came back, the container was all mangled, and it took several years for her to heal, and she's not fully healed. But it was wonderful. So when you mentioned that, I need to say the difference between the two. Do you believe in reincarnation?
Yes and no.
Go for it.
I think consciousness survives bodily death, and I think it takes on other life forms. But I don't believe in some kind of personal balloon that pops from one body to another. I'm also trained in Hindu and Buddhist philosophy, and contrary to what people might assume, those systems are very sophisticated around this question, and they tend to say yes and no as well. They tend to say yes, there's something that passes on, that life goes on, life is not destroyed with death, but the personality, the social ego is precisely what you have to get beyond to really understand what's going on. And if you don't get beyond it, you'll just be born again and again, and you'll just be in this system, assuming that you're a real entity. And when you realize that the social ego is not real and that you're not that person, then you won't reincarnate again. That's the general model. So I'm not signing my name to that model, but I think something like reincarnation happens. But again, I don't believe in a personal survival from one life to another. I mean, just to be simplistic about it, if I was someone else in my previous life and now I'm Jeff, where's the survival of the person? I mean, I'm a different person now, but there's some kind of life form, or there's some kind of consciousness that carries on over those life cycles that I happen to think. I also think, I mean, I'm speculating. I think anyone who's had children, I often joke, I first really believed in reincarnation after we had children. Because first of all, they're totally different. They clearly are not determined by their environment or by their parents even. They pop out of the womb as people. I'm like, what? How did that happen? I mean, I naively thought of this blank slate theory, before we had kids. I thought, the child's born, kind of a blank slate. You sort of mold that child to. I'm like, that's freaking bullshit, right? I don't believe that for a second. I think being a parent is basically about not screwing up what the kid is. It's like, get out of the
It
way,
should be. Yes, it should be.
get out of the way, give that being a supportive, loving environment, but do not try to tell that being what it is. Because it, first of all, you can do that, you'll screw it up. You'll mess up the person, and they'll spend the rest of their life being messed up. Or you can get out of the way and you can let the being be the being.
I think that's one of our problems in humanity, is that we impose our containership on our kids.
Right. Well, yeah, I try not to, but I mean, I think that's a big problem. And I mean, I work with young people, and I also work with young people right as they've moving away from their families and trying to ask questions. And so I work with them. I work with them on a very existential level, and I'm like, okay, not everything that your host culture community said to you is probably going to work for you. Some of it will, some of it won't. And the question I ask them is, well, are you happy in the story you're living right now? Is it working for you? Or is it not working for you? And sometimes the story works fine. And I'm like, okay, go live in your story. That's fine. Go live in that story. But someday that story's not going to work so well. It's going to look pretty ragged around the edges, or you're going to have some experience, or you're going to have a child, or something's going to happen, and that story's not going to work so well anymore. And if you think you are that story, that's a problem. But if you think you are living in a story and you can live in a different story if you like, then you have a lot more flexibility, and you can be a much bigger human being, I think.
Let me go back to what you said a couple of minutes ago about like a personal balloon leaving one body. You have difficulties in believing that you pop out and then go into another body.
Right.
I think I share that. Again, it's just a belief. So I just try to explore these things as best as possible with zero training, other than just my desire to explore. What if we are not trading one for one when we die and we come back in another body? Like when we die, we're just, bear with me here for a second, because I'm going to preface this by saying that we're looking at getting an expert on octopuses on the podcast. Yeah. And this person apparently, is what we understand, also studies how studies the consciousness of an octopus. But I say this because maybe we are not one for one.
No, I don't think so.
Well, so maybe we're spiritually speaking, maybe we're just fragments of a larger whole. So that Jeff walking the earth is a container, is just a container of a shard of some essence of consciousness that once it stops reincarnating is part of a larger whole. So you are, in human terms, you are maybe represented by 2.3 million people. And that's why we have so many personalities. These personalities are all actually just part of one. They're just represented as a different personality, but they're actually just shards that come together. I don't know. It's just a thought.
Well, that's idealism. What you just articulated is a form of idealism. And it's the notion there's really only one consciousness, and then it gets split up into different personalities. I have a friend, Bernardo Kastrup. He calls us, what does he call us? Well, he calls us alters, alters. You have a personality, multiple personality disorder. Well, God essentially has a multiple personality disorder or order, depending on your perspective, I guess, and that it splits up into all these people. I don't know. I don't distinguish human consciousness from the octopus, though, by the way, or my dog, or things I eat, by the way. I think life and consciousness flow into and out of one another in a very profound way. And again, this goes back to my training in Hindu and Buddhist philosophy. They don't restrict reincarnation to the human reincarnation either, by the way.
Right.
And I think that's essentially correct. I think, though, once you make that move, it becomes very hard to eat things.
I didn't think of this.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is where
burgers.
some of, like Jainism, for example, is a radically vegetarian tradition because it tries to avoid all violence and of course, killing a creature and grilling that creature and cooking that creature, and I mean, it's very violent. Now, I eat meat, so I'm a hypocrite here. But I know I'm a hypocrite.
Yes.
And I think that helps a little, but I'm just telling you where this stuff goes.
No,
this is where it goes philosophically. And my point isn't, I know the truth, you have to listen to me. My point is, no, let's put all this stuff on the table.
Agreed.
And let's start thinking about it. And it'll take us in different directions. We don't know where it'll take. And by the way, one of the literatures that really impresses me is small children who remember previous lives. So even when I say that there's no balloon, I do think memories can kind of pass on. And I don't think it generally works like people think it works, but small children do remember previous lives as different people. But when they age, they tend to lose those memories because they have to become another person. And that's my point. Is that if you're many people, you've got a problem. It's hard to live in society. It's hard enough to live as one person. But if you remember all your previous lives and you're 3 or 4 people, back a few centuries or so, you're messed up, man. You got problems.
We had a researcher, Antonia Mills, on reincarnation.
Yeah,
she's from Canada.
Yeah, I know her.
Okay, so she was hired by Ian Stevenson back in the late 70s, early 80s. But she made light of something that had never occurred to me, is that in her studies, and maybe she wasn't the first to say either, because there are a few other experts. Jim Tucker, we want to get him on the show too. She found precocious children are usually ones that have better recall memory of a past life if they have a past life. And so I took that in the reading, I took that into my own life. And there are very few precocious children that I know now. I mean, I'm middle-aged now, so most of the kids I know are teenagers, right? Friends and family. But there are a few. And I interviewed their parents, just casual interview. And I've asked them, do they have experiences? Do they have experiences that you can't make sense of that they've recalled? And 2 out of the 3 parents said, yeah. And they gave me use the word eerie, just an eerie story on how they remember something that they had no idea they could remember.
Yeah.
Sorry, actually, it shouldn't be a digression, but it was a digression for this conversation because I want to get at one other thing here before I ask you my last question. I want to go back to the question about belief and about myth making. Mm-hmm. So I have been very, very curious about how the artist, and so I believe we're all artists at some level, but how the artist, the person who chooses artistry as a vocation, sees the world. And I've been finding that I've gained a lot of respect for people who act. So they create something out of nothing. Yeah. Use their imagination to create a character, and then they throw themselves into it, like a comedian would throw themselves into a system to make fun of it. And they play. And they're the first person in this podcast, his name is Enrico Colantoni. He was the first guest on the podcast. He's a close friend of ours and close friend of mine. He was on Broadway just this past spring. So we took a family trip and went to go see him. And it was in New York, obviously, Broadway. At the end of the show, and by the way, the show was, I think you would have really liked the show because there are themes there on human existence and the afterlife. I didn't expect it. But he played this one character throughout many, many decades, as a kid to his 70s on stage. Anyway, so it came to the end of the show. Actors all came out. Everybody got their applause. There was a standing ovation. And of course, I was giving my friend a standing ovation. It was a wonderful, like I'm getting goosebumps as I explain this. He put his, he was a co-star, or I forget what they call it. He was one of the main characters. And so he locked hands with the female head lead actress, Deborah Messing. That's right. Deborah Messing. So they had their hands up, clasped up in the air as a thank you and bowing. And he started to cry uncontrollably, like a child would. Like he was shaking his head turned red. And I found it beautiful. I found myself crying. And I asked him later, so we met up after the show for a few minutes, and I said, I couldn't help but notice you were really emotional. He goes, how can you not be? And so then we had another conversation about it a few weeks later. And then I thought, and I didn't ask him. So this is, I guess, the question to you. The actor, the artist who believes something that does not exist, I think has that emotional experience afterwards, because they realize if they created something real, not fake, and that they cry because they come back to the container, and the container is not enough for them.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
Well, I have lots of thoughts. I mean, of course, we're all actors, right? I mean, we're acting right now. I often joke that religion is art that doesn't know it's art. And, I had a friend who, I'm thinking of my friend here, who's passed away now. And he used to write Superman and Batman comic strips. And he wrote this autobiography in which he's told to become Clark Kent. I mean, not Clark Kent, Bruce Wayne. He's supposed to become Bruce Wayne. And he says to the spirit, he says, well, but I'm not, I can't become Bruce Wayne because I'm Alvin Schwartz. And the voice says, well, Alvin Schwartz isn't real either. It's just an act. Of course you can become Bruce Wayne. It's just another act. And so it's this like metaphysical teaching about how every human persona, the word person is from the Latin for mask. And it comes from the theater. It's what we speak through. This is a mask. You're a mask. And if your friend is crying on stage and because he's created something real, well, we're real too, but we're really not real. And of course, what he created on the stage isn't really real. It's not permanently real. It's real for that moment. Yeah. And so I think that insight is one we should weep at in joy or release or fear, depending on where we're at in our life cycle. So that's what I would say. I would say we literally are in a show right now, and we really are acting. And your friend was correct to weep, not because of his performance, but because we're all performing all the time, and maybe he's starting to become aware of that.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
I'm gonna share this with him.
Please.
Last question. Yeah. Sorry.
I'll just tell you, a footnote. When I was in graduate school, one of my slightly older colleagues, a guy named David Haberman, he wrote his dissertation, and the book became Acting as a Way of Salvation. And it's on this very idea, actually, in India, actually. But the notion is that by acting these different mythical parts, you become those mythical beings, and you realize that the self is not, it's not really who you are.
Real. It's a persona.
Yeah.
Ask.
Yeah.
Last question, Jeff.
Okay.
What is greatness to you?
What is greatness?
No.
Well, greatness is knowing you're not your mask. It's knowing you're not who you think you are, and nor is anyone else. And we're much greater than we think we are. We think we're contained in these little bodies and that we're speaking to one another, when in fact we're also outside of our bodies, and we're the ones directing and writing and acting in this play or this movie we're in right now. That's greatness to me.
One last note here. We didn't even discuss you being banned in India, discuss being anorexic as a teen, right. Joining a monastery and understanding human psychology at a very deep level. Then maybe this is the impetus to have a part 2.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to chat. And that early life experience, particularly being anorexic, which was all about a kind of an obsessive compulsive disorder, was me having to realize that my deepest beliefs were just beliefs, and they were making me sick, and they were going to kill me eventually if I continued. So I had to doubt I had to not believe my guilt. Try that, for a while. But I had to realize that there was such a thing as false guilt, and that one could be intensely guilty about something for which one was completely innocent.
That's where I envy you in your experience, because at a very young age, you took a hammer to your beliefs and you understood that you needed to take a hammer.
Yeah, but the thing is, Jeff didn't take a hammer to somebody took a hammer to his beliefs for sure. Some part of Jeff did. But personally, I didn't want my beliefs hammered. But they were, you're absolutely right. They were shattered. They were utterly shattered.
You said, and I promise this is the last thing I'll say. You did say in the last conversation we had many months ago, when we were talking about your belief in belief and not beliefs, you said you find exploration delicious. Mm-hmm. Just leave it at that.
Yeah, I do. Some people find it terrifying. I find this kind of opening delicious and wonderful, and exactly where we should be.
Jeff, thank you so much for coming on. Wonderful conversation.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure.
Hey, it's Enrico Colantoni here, actor, director, and dedicated napper. Like what you heard today, there's more to come. Make sure to subscribe to Behind Greatness and learn about our live events at inspirenorth.com. You'll also find links to our social media right on our website, so be sure to give us a like and follow. Until next time, stay inspired.